Okay, so where we stopped last time in class was with the Alien and Sedition Acts. We had gone through the Alien Acts, and remember there were three of them. Our bigger concern, particularly as relates to the FCLE, is going to be the Sedition Act, which raises First Amendment issues. And just to review that, this one was passed and made it punishable by fine and or imprisonment for anyone to conspire in opposition to the government, aid insurrections. That part of it is pretty standard. That's still the law today. If you remember the January 6th riots, the people who were prosecuted, convicted, and later pardoned, most of those were convicted under the Sedition Act. The part that raises the First Amendment concern is the next part after the semicolon. Write, print, utter, or publish statements that brought the government, Congress, or president into disrepute. So the first part, if you conspire to oppose the government in performing its job or you aid an insurrection, that's still going to be a criminal activity. The concerns that we have over criticizing the government, those are First Amendment issues. All right. There were not a lot of prosecutions under this, but 25 people arrested, 15 indicted. And again, we looked at the quotation there from Luther Baldwin. I believe that was in New Jersey. All right. This one was highly publicized across the nation in the newspapers that the Jeffersonians ran. We're getting very close to the point where we're going to have organized political parties. Remember, we classify Washington, or some people classify Washington as a Federalist, but there were no political parties during his administration. The same is true in Adams' administration. We really do not yet have organized political parties by name. They are starting to organize, and you have an organized opposition coming into play. Jefferson is really the head of that. Madison is lining up with him, still in Congress, but they are not really taking a formal name. They're publishing under newspapers, but you do not have a name to that party. It is going to be the Democratic Republican Party, and the other party, of course, representing Adams, Hamilton, is going to be the Federalists, but they are not really formal yet. We kind of backdate them and call them Federalists and or Democratic Republicans at this point in time and all the way back to Washington because of their policies and the way they line up with what will be those parties, but we don't actually have formal parties yet. All right. This was the screen that we left off on. We had just flipped to it. We did not get to discuss it. What you have here is going to be something that's very important. These two documents, the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves or the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, are documents that you may see on the FCLE. They are also critical as we start building towards the Civil War and the South's justification for secession. All right. And what you have is the national government, the federal government, under control primarily of the Federalist Party. Adams has the presidency, right? You know, Thomas Jefferson is his vice president. That means he lost at this point in time. He was the runner-up. But you also have a majority in Congress that is Federalist. And so the only alternative is pretty much like you see today. The party that is out of power turns to the states to resist the federal government, right? And so what you see is resolutions coming from these two states. This is two separate documents. They're usually discussed together, though, right? The Kentucky Assembly passes a resolution, and basically it says that the federal government had violated the Bill of Rights, and each state had the right to judge those infractions and to decide the appropriate action or the appropriate redress, right? And notice the word nullification there. That's going to be important. We will have a nullification crisis when we get up to the not Jefferson, the Jackson administration. All right, and it's going to pop up several times. Basically, what nullification means is a nullification of the federal law. In other words, the federal law will be nullified by the state government within its borders. So in this case, it's Kentucky. Kentucky nullifies that law, meaning various things, depending on how you interpret it, but at a minimum, that they will not assist the federal government in carrying out that federal law whatsoever. Taken to an extreme, when we get to the nullification crisis and what's being advocated here, that, say, a federal agent goes to arrest somebody for violating the Sedition Act, if the state of Kentucky believes that's a violation of free speech or free press rights, then they actively go in and, say, arrest the federal marshal or whomever's carrying out that law. So they actively resist the carrying out of that federal law by trying to stop the federal government from carrying it out. The Kentucky resolve was written by, it's believed, Thomas Jefferson. We're almost sure of that. All right. It was much more confrontational than what you saw coming from Virginia. The Virginia resolution was written by James Madison, and its idea was basically the same, that the states were bound to prevent it and to resist abridgments of people's liberties when the federal government overreached. But it did not go so far as to advocate for nullification in the sense that you actively resist it, as in going out and, say, arresting federal officers or preventing them from carrying out their jobs. If you are focusing on the FCLE, I think the guiding law today is the case Prince versus the United States, which involved background checks when people were buying firearms. And at the time, there was not a database set up at the federal level yet, and the federal law required local law enforcement agencies to carry out background checks for the federal government. And it was ruled, when two law enforcement agencies refused to do it, that the local jurisdictions were correct. So the current law on that is not going to the extent of Jefferson. You can't go out there as a state and arrest an ICE agent, for example, if you're looking at what's going on in Minnesota recently, for carrying out their job, right? But what you can do is refuse to cooperate. So you're passing a federal law, federal agents carry it out. There's nothing that you can do to force a state to carry out that law for you. The local law enforcement can say that's up to you, right? And decline to assist in any way. So that is an issue of federalism, not of the Second Amendment. Where that comes in as an issue is you will find a lot of people who are pro-gun rights who love the Prince decision because the impact was to avoid background checks when people bought firearms. They hate sanctuary cities, which is actually the exact same thing, because it's the law enforcement in the local jurisdiction refusing to just carry out federal law or, do the federal, in this case, ICE agents' job for them, right? But it's basically the same constitutional principle. All right. At this time, they don't get a lot of support, and they're not enforced even in the South. By 1799, we're, again, still seem like we're on the brink of war with France, and the popular opinion, even in the South, is very much anti-French. And so these resolves do not get much support at this point in time. They kind of linger out there and are not important until we really get closer to the Civil War. So they are minor documents when they are written. They are more important um, later, really at the Civil War. They kind of decline again in importance after the Civil War. They come back again as you move into the 20th century and states' rights issues start to pop up again. All right. Now, what happens here is Adams is essentially going to sacrifice his career in politics for the good of the country. Word comes from France that Talleyrand, the foreign minister for France, is willing to negotiate. Adams sends a new set of peace commissioners. Everybody in his cabinet, remember, they were Federalists, but they were really allies of Hamilton and not of Adams. They were highly upset. Pickering refuses to send the commissioners. Adams fires him, sends them anyway. And when they get there, they do negotiate a peaceful relation that prevents us from going to war, a war, by the way, that we were completely unprepared for. Again, we did not have a Navy at all going into this. We had completely disbanded our Navy and Marine Corps. We had a very small Army. Primarily, its purpose was to patrol the frontier lands and borders with the European controlled areas. Maybe 3,000 people at some one point. We did raise an army, very much useless because without a navy, we could not get it to France. It's essentially a question of who we were going to fight because we had no way of getting to France. France is not really in any position to fight over here. They did not really have a presence. So there was no real way we could fight a war, literally. No way to fight the war because we couldn't get into the fight. Right. This is going to be followed by the election. And if you looked at the date, we're moving into the end of 1798 there, into 1799. 1800 is the election year. The Federalists now are completely divided between the Adams and the Hamilton faction. Hamilton actively trying to unseat the president. And basically, he's going to make efforts that are going to essentially kill the Federalist chances of winning the presidency or anything else for that matter. Jefferson is basically going to be running against him again. This time they have an organized party. You're really starting to see those Democratic Republicans coming out with a large measure of organization. Jefferson represents the classic Democrat Republican from the South. He is from Virginia, and that pretty much is going to draw support from the southern states, Maryland on down. There are many states that have a more democratic approach, but they are not as agriculturally oriented in their economies. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, for example, the mid-Atlantic states. Those states, you needed Aaron Burr on the ticket, or that was the expectation, with the hope that they would draw some of those people who are kind of in the middle. They have some very Federalist leanings in the business sense, but they tend to be much more democratic in a political sense. All right. This was a coordinated effort, and the attempt was going to be to secure the presidency and the vice presidency. This turns into one of the more interesting elections, resulting in our First Amendment since the Bill of Rights was passed. All right. As they go in and they plan, you have to remember that basically every elector gets 2 votes. They have to vote for at least one person who is not from their home state, so that prevents them from basically reaching a fully unanimous vote in the sense that you're going to have some votes for somebody else so that you have a vice president this time. And remember, the winner president, second place vice president. The way that you can get this to the point of getting both is if you can get a majority to support your party and get all of them to vote for two candidates that you support, you could create a vice president and presidential majority. The problem was that they didn't plan well enough, and what you ended up with was all of the electors for Jefferson and Burr voting for Jefferson and Burr. And what that ends up with is a tie. All right. Adams ends with 65. And so what happens then is instead of a majority for Jefferson or a clear-cut win, you end up with nobody getting an actual majority. And in that case, what happens is the House of Representatives makes the decision. Now, in this election, you are going to have a clean sweep. The president's vote, as you can see, Jefferson and Burr both got 75, Adams got 65. So you see the Democratic Republicans were more popular across the country. All right. You also had the Congress going to the Democratic Republicans in this election as well. This is where it gets tricky because the election gets thrown into the House of Representatives, and it was not this newly elected Democratic Republican House that decided who was going to be the next president. It was the outgoing Federalist majority House that was going to make the decision. All right. And they actually went through vote after vote with no resolution. Some of the Federalists started considering supporting Burr over Jefferson and Adams, thinking that one thing you don't want to do is go against the absolute will of the people. The will of the people expressed that they want a Democratic Republican. And the reality is that Jefferson was the person. But Burr, they're looking at him as he is from a moderate state that has a little bit more of an inclination. It's going to have some interests that line up with the Federalists and maybe a better choice from the Federalist perspective than Jefferson. Now, the problem was that Hamilton and Burr both are from New York. They are political rivals. They don't like each other. And Hamilton is actually going to be the one who breaks the deadlock, writing to the people who are considering Burr on the Federalist side and saying that this guy is the most dangerous person in America. He's trying to set himself up as a tyrant. And he is the one who gets them convinced to swing their votes over to Jefferson. And now Burr himself takes a lot of heat from this. He is going to really, as you kind of imagine, not be accepted in to the Jefferson administration. It is now, if you read the biographies, there's a lot of debate on this. Burr himself, they were asked, like Jefferson, other people, that he should have come in and withdrawn his name, come in and said, don't vote for me. Jefferson's the guy. Apparently, he did not actively ever promote himself as a viable candidate for president. He shows up ready to work and apparently unaware that there's any hard feelings, very supportive of Jefferson from what he says. But Jefferson's already kind of locked him out and has no trust of him. He goes on to be eventually tried for treason for trying to steal the entire western half of the country and set himself up as president of that during Jefferson's second term. And look at that separately. But his treason trial is also very famous. I think I may have misspoke. I think I said this election resulted in the First Amendment post-Bill of Rights. It's actually the second. The 12th Amendment, this is where we now get the process that we have for electing presidents, where you vote for president and vice president on separate ballots. So instead of having, say, uh, President Trump and Vice President Harris right now, we had the ticket where you had Trump Vance or Harris Waltz. And if one wins, they have a member of their own party coming in automatically as the vice president. All right. That amendment was passed to prevent this kind of instance from ever happening again. And the 11th Amendment was one we didn't talk so much about, but it came from the fact that a person in a state sued and won against his home state. It in a federal court basically says that you can't do that. You can't sue your own state in a federal court. You have to go through the state court system for that. A little bit more complex than that, but we don't have a lot of focus on the 11th Amendment, apparently, on the FCLE at this point in time. All right. This election is often referred to as the Revolution of 1800. The reason being, and this is important, this was a complete shift in political direction, and it took place completely without any violent revolution. The revolution was done through the ballot, all right? And for the foreseeable future, what you would see was this division within the country, with the Federalists in New England having a dominance, all right? This area would have a lot of commercial ties with England that go back all the way to the colonial period, all right? They were suspicious of the French Revolution and what they viewed as the anarchy from it, all right? From Maryland on south, at this point, that was considered the South, and Jefferson and his party dominated there. And then the middle states were going to be the ones that determined the elections. Those were New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and tended to be a split. They had some business interests that lined up more like New England. There were also, of course, a lot of areas that were agricultural in those states, tended to be more moderate, to use a modern term. There's also another thing that's not on here. This basically describes our 13 original states. Keep in mind that we have started adding states in the West. And for the first half of our history, we oftentimes think of it as North and South. But there are actually three regions, three major players. There's the North, the South, and the West. And each of those has distinct interests. And the West is also going to have the uniqueness of being divided up between essentially kind of like the North and the Southwest, with part of the West being free territory, part of the West being slave territory, and its role leading up to the Civil War oftentimes being, a part of keeping a balance between free and slave territory, and how that influences that critical issue at the federal level. All right. This map kind of shows you that because, as you can see, we have Vermont already coming in as a state. We have Kentucky and Tennessee. You notice that at this election, their electoral vote count is pretty low, but it is a very close election. And this is one that is close enough that those states are really able to make a difference. I should also point out that if you remember, we discussed the Three-Fifths Compromise back when we discussed the creation of the Constitution. And we had also looked at the work that discussed the 5 Black presidents. And one of the things that was discussed in that was the fact that the press often referred to Jefferson as, quote, the Negro president during his administration. And I think that was something of a misnomer that was interpreted by the author of that work, that he may have, according to the public or the press at least, have had some African heritage, which is arguable for just about everybody who has a history going back to early colonial, particularly Southern history. But I think really the reference is more to the fact that he was elected by the non-existent black vote at this time. And what do I mean by that? Well, the Three-Fifths Compromise gives Virginia, as you can see, 21 electoral votes. Massachusetts has, as you can see, 16 electoral votes. But if you did not have that Three-Fifths Compromise and the only people counted to determine how many electors you got was the free people, then Massachusetts would have still had 16 and Virginia would have had something like 13. And actually, if not for the Three-Fifths Compromise, if only the free vote counted, then Adams actually would have won re-election to a second term as president. So keep that in mind as well, that what actually pushes Jefferson over the top is not the fact that you have free people voting for him. You have free people voting for people who are actually enslaved. And that's across the South. Kentucky and Tennessee, even though that their votes are low, they are slave states. Kentucky, probably, and for that matter, Tennessee, probably lower slave populations percentage-wise than probably any of the other states over there at this point in time. That does change over the course of time, but regardless, there are still some people there who are held in bondage, and they are only being represented in the polls by the slave owners, right? Or I should say the slave owning class, because of course not all the voters do own slaves. All right, I should say that, but still. Federalist support tends to come from the business class, as it says, merchants, manufacturers, commercial farmers in the North, usually ones living close to the coast. Jefferson, he gets his supports from the anti-federalists, usually farmers, big plantation owners in the South, and also generally smaller farmers, again, usually in the South, and people who tend to be further away from urban areas. It does say the coast, but keep in mind most of the urban areas are on the coast at this point in time. All right, when Jefferson comes in, these are his main goals. Number one, he wants to alleviate the political divide, or calm the political storms, consolidate his victory, and rescue the government from federalist, in his view, mismanagement, and set it on a more Republican or Democratic course. To his view, 2 and 3, those are very similar. What he means by that is to get rid of most of the Federalists who were appointed in office, fire everybody, in other words, and fill them with people who are Republicans. All right. About November 1800, the government was moving to the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. This was a very small place at the time. About 5,000 people were living there. Most of those were going to be tied to this federal government in some kind of way. Notice in November, that's when the election is. Today, the inauguration doesn't take place until the next year in January. Back then, it didn't take place until March. So John Adams is actually the first person to inhabit the White House and to govern from Washington, but not for a very long time. Jefferson's going to be the first person where that's the capital the entire time of his administration. Pierre L'Enfant was the Frenchman who was hired as the architect. If you drive up to D.C., you'll see L'Enfant Plaza as I think the first actual exit off of three. I think it's 395 when you drive up the interstate. Uh, as an aside, the architect actually quit, and although he doesn't get the credit, and L'Enfant's name is still attached to it, a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Banneker actually did most of the work, who was um, African American. I believe he had been a freed slave. He may have been free from birth. I can't recall off the top of my head, but he actually was one of these people who was, as they would term, a Renaissance man. He was, uh, skilled in multiple endeavors. Obviously, architect was what he was tagged at for this job. Today, it would probably, you're laying out a whole city, so it'd be more tagged as an urban planner by today's definitions. Uh, but he was also a publisher, an astronomer. He had devised a almanac that was a rival or an alternative to Poor Richard's almanac that Ben Franklin had published. But he is actually the one who finished up the work, and most of the planning may have been started by L'Enfant, but most of the actual building was done by an African American, and actually done during Jefferson's administration, which, knowing his views on African Americans, is something of an oddity as well, because he was later on, after his presidency was over, so well after this, he was still noted for having some very racist ideas and some ideas that people of African descent were inferior, inherently inferior and less intelligent, blah, blah, blah. He was not a person you would expect to employ someone African American in that kind of endeavor. But I think that the person, L'Enfant, had actually been put in that position already, and Jefferson didn't have a choice in it. All right. Jefferson as himself, very simple inauguration. Again, one of the oddities or things, misconceptions, whatever you want to term it, Jefferson kept his inauguration simple. He actually came in a very simple dress, homespun, as it would say, dressed down, tried to look like a simple farmer, dressed well, but not fancy. He had, through his campaign, this effort, it was really the first, very, how would you say, mudslinging campaign. They had a lot of back and forth in the press. At this time, the candidates themselves did not promote themselves, but did so through intermediaries. Other people did the campaigning for them, and the press did the campaigning. But with that said, you kind of knew who was behind these things, and you really saw that falling out between Adams and Jefferson. And they were calling Adams personal stuff. They called him fat. They gave him like a royal, said he was trying to set himself up as a king, and always trying to give him up with fancy titles. They referred to him as his rotundity because he was overweight. And of course, the responses, which were true, was that Jefferson was having children with Sally Heming, his slave. And again, one of the funny things about this was that the perception that people had was that Jefferson was the man of the people, and Adams was like this aristocrat. And you can find stories, of course, as you can imagine. Jefferson is the guy that's sitting up here at this like palace, Monticello, with someone else, managing the slave labor while he's sitting on the porch and at most maybe doing the books, you know, sipping on, you know, mint juleps, watching other people do all the work. And you find these stories of like John Adams, you know, who was primarily an attorney who actually worked, but also, like most people at that time, um, also worked a small farm, which they did for food. But you find the stories of him out here in the field hiring laborers, but out here in the field, taking off his shirt and out here, you know, with a scythe harvesting in the wheat and working just like everybody else. And it's kind of like the perception and the reality are completely opposite each other all the way around. But Jefferson has this enduring image in our country, right? Adams is always kind of like left out, and it kind of stayed that way until this guy, David McCullough, wrote a biography of John Adams back in the 1990s. A lot of renewed interest in Adams at that. They even did an HBO series on his life, I think in the early 2000s. But still, Jefferson, is not my favorite, but a lot of people still hold him in high esteem. I think when you dig into him, I tend to like Adams a lot better, even though his personality might be a little bit more grating. He was known for being a curmudgeon old man, but as his image, and he probably was always critical, always, not the nice guy, but I think he always held to his principles more. All right. Anyway, as you start moving towards the switch, Adams is going to try to stick as many people into office as he can. And one of those particularly important offices is going to be the judgeships. And the reason why is because you can't get around this one if you're Jefferson. The Constitution says that every federal judge serves for life as long as they don't do anything the term that they use is good behavior. But essentially, you'd have to impeach them, and we today do that only for criminal behavior. Right? They got a Federalist Congress to push through a Judiciary Act that increased the number of courts, and that also therefore increased the number of judges. Along with that, that also increases the number of marshals and court clerks. So Adams is filling all of these positions with Federalists, and they do get Jefferson in there, who repeals the act, and he tries to purge those people. But again, you can fire the marshals and clerks, but you can't do away with the judges. All right. Now, the way they can do away with it, again, as I said, was to impeach them. And they go after this. John Pickering is one of those, and this guy is kind of like an easy mark because he's delivering opinions, and he goes off on a lot of political tirades as he's delivering his opinions. All right. Not exactly criminal, and I don't think that would it'd probably get a lot of press today and a lot of attention, but it wouldn't be criminal, and I don't think you get you might support an impeachment in the House. You shouldn't get a conviction in the Senate today. All right. The next one was brought against Samuel Chase, who, again, was doing the similar thing. He was bringing a lot of political discussion into what he was saying in the bench. But basically, during the trial, it became obvious that he had not committed any crime whatsoever, and he was acquitted. This is important. The trial of Samuel Chase sets a precedent where we do not have impeachments just because you don't like what the guy says or because of the person's politics. We have an impeachment, and we put the person out of office because the person does something criminal. It's very closely related to the idea that we have that protection of freedom of speech for those members of the federal offices just like we do for the people who are regular citizens, but in this extends to their job. All right. Um, Now, impeachment is discussed in the Constitution, but only really for the presidency. It does state there that the president can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. It does not necessarily have to extend that requirement to other offices, but we essentially have done that through this precedent. All right. If you look at recent developments, you'll see that, oh, the current president has really tried to make a push to reverse that in recent years, so unsuccessfully so far. All right. All right. All right. Basically, the Sedition Act, you start seeing the end of prosecution, freeing of the victims, and they basically just let it lapse in 1802. And we do, of course, as I mentioned, have a Sedition Act now. It does not have the parts in it that are directed towards speech. All right. It is purely projected at the parts stopping the government from carrying out its business, essentially. Right. The interesting thing is sedition as a crime historically before the revolution is essentially the crime of criticizing your government, speaking out against your government. So when you see that crime in a historical sense, that essentially is what it was. The last part that was objection was historically what it actually was. So the current definition of it that we have under the Sedition Act, where we prosecuted people from January 6th, is actually a much newer interpretation of it. All right, the idea of insurrections and so forth, rather than speech. All right. All right. Jefferson also dismantled the inspection system that were used to enforce the Alien Act, so they kind of stayed on the books for a little while without being enforced, but they did get Congress to restore the 5-year requirement rather than the 14 years. And then, of course, they disbanded the army that was being put together. Adams likely would have done that anyway, since the threat of war with France was already gone. All right. Jefferson also shrank the government. It at this time only had 3,000 employees. 300 of those were in Washington. But he shrank it even more. You can kind of see over here on this chart what we have here as far as revenues. All right. And you can see the revenues are still basically going up until 1800. You see that even with the shrinking, the revenues are going to kind of stay the same. Most of that's going to go to debt service. Right. Right. And then we get into what is Jefferson's vision. This can be also overstated. This is the standard view of Jefferson's vision for America. He believes in an expanded agrarian or agricultural nation. Basically, obviously in the South, you had planters who were determined to maintain slavery. All right. If you dig into it a little bit, they are oftentimes viewed as tracing their ideology back to Athens and to Athenian democracy, which, if you go back to ancient Athens, had a democratic government that was basically built on slavery also, which was basically other people do all the work, and that frees up the people who own slaves so that they can actually participate in government. Now, obviously, not everybody in the South owned slaves who was white. It was actually a minority who owned slaves, but what you had here was a plan for an elitist group, all right, to dominate that government, primarily all the way up to the Civil War. You're going to have a system that's in place that allows the Southern planters, and it's not going to be just farmers, but the Southern planters, they mean the big plantation owners, typically people who own more than 50 slaves and a lot of acreage, are going to be the ones who dominate politics. People who own less than that in terms of both slaves and property can vote, right? Keep in mind that there's also going to be restrictions on who can run for office. So you may be able to vote if you own 50 acres, right? And if you own 50 acres, there's a likelihood that you can work that by yourself and don't necessarily need slave labor, and a strong possibility that you don't have slave labor. If you go beyond that, there's a strong probability that you have one or two slaves. If you go up to these big slave owners who own, like Jefferson, 20 some thousand acres, these people have hundreds of slaves. As the higher you go in office, oftentimes the higher the acreage is. They almost never mention that I've seen any property requirement in terms of slaves, but it's almost always tied to it in reality. So if you have 20,000 acres, you almost never see anybody hiring labor for that. They almost always, in fact, I have never seen an instance where somebody is hiring labor to run like some 20,000 or bigger plantation. They're always using slave labor from what I have seen, right? There might be some outlier, but I've never seen it. So basically, if you have to run, you run for governor, you might have to have 5,000 acres. You run for state senate, you might have to have 1,000 acres. You might need only 100 acres to run for the lower house in the state. But basically what that does is that keeps the political clout within the hands of that larger plantation owning class. You can vote with less, but you can't vote for yourself. You are limited in who you vote for to these people who have immense land ownings, and that keeps the political power in their hands. All right. The lower and middle class Southerners, all right, likewise, even though they may not own slaves, are still committed to this idea. Why? Well, because that's what they see themselves becoming, right? And this is what, if you go to John Hope Franklin, this is the textbook that we used to use for African American history. Hopefully we teach that again, but there's a chapter in there called The American Paradox. And a paradox is where something seems like it's almost a hypocritical statement, like it's opposites, but that there's a grain of truth in it. The American democracy is expanding. At the same time, democracy is being taken away. How in the heck does that work? Well, democracy is going to be expanded for certain groups, i.e., white males. So as you move to the West, Tennessee, for example, Kentucky, as we mentioned, later Alabama, Mississippi, these places, you will not see property requirements for voting. You might see those for holding office. But you will see, obviously, not only no African Americans voting there, but in those states we mentioned after the Revolution, like North Carolina, that were slave states that allowed free blacks to vote, the right to vote being taken away. Right? I believe South Carolina, and not a slave state, but New Jersey, allowed women to vote. They only listed property as a requirement. The property requirements go away as you move out west, but even in those states on the east where women were allowed to vote, that right goes away. So the right to vote is being taken away from some groups while it is being expanded within the white male population. All right. And arguably, that Athenian view is that we are seeing a society that is building a democracy for white males and they're building it on the backs of other people providing the labor and the economic capacity to allow these people to have more time, education, everything else to actively participate in politics. All right. Western farmers, northern artisans, all of these people that you see, as they say, devoted to self-sufficiency, or in the case of the northern artisans, um, harboring an aversion to slavery, doesn't necessarily play out the way you might would think. The northern artisans, why do they harbor an aversion to slavery? Well, as you can see, that rarely means a commitment to racial equality. Well, part of that is because their aversion to slavery is due to the existence of slavery in the North. Yes, it's going away, but for example, the first slave revolt in the country actually takes place in New York City. And the reason why is it's not like in the South where slaves are primarily going to be used for um, agricultural and unskilled labor. What you had was slaves being taught trades and being used to reduce the cost of trade labor, i.e., blacksmiths, coopers. And what that was also doing for the artisans, that trade skilled class, was, in their view, driving their wages down. So they hated slavery because they viewed it as competition, and not because they had any aversion to it out of any moral opposition to it. And you would see, let's say, Western farmers devoted to self-sufficiency, right? And that varied. To keep in mind that when we talk about the West, some of the West is going to be in the North, some of the West is going to be Southern territories. So that might not necessarily work out the way you would expect, either because, yes, the people moving out on the frontier would have a commitment to, self-sufficiency, but they're eventually going to also want to increase their economic stature. So particularly in the South where slavery is available, they bring slavery into it. The first true slave revolt in the United States, by the way, was 1712 was the date of it, and that was in New York City. All right. Small by the standards later. Keep in mind the slave population in New York City was relatively small at that point in time. All right. Jefferson's idea was that liberty could only survive when everybody was a landowner, though, the yeoman farmer, the small farmer. The idea, it kind of makes sense, is basically that if you work for somebody, that person controls your everything. I mean, later on, this is going to be termed as wage slavery up in the North. But basically, if you work in a factory, for example, you draw a paycheck, your boss tells you to vote for somebody, you vote for them, because if you don't, you get fired. If you get fired, then you don't eat, you don't have a house, and essentially you have no choice except to do what they say. All right. Keep in mind, things worked differently in politics back then. Today, your boss tells you to vote a certain way, you're going to be like, forget that. Even if you're inclined to, you might tell them, yeah, sure, I'll vote for whomever. Go in and pull the lever for whomever you want, and tell the boss you voted for the guy they wanted to. They can't do anything about it. That's because we have what's called the secret ballot, which was something that you don't see until almost the 20th century. And it's also called the Australian ballot because that's where we got that idea from. Back in this period, you go down and you vote publicly so everybody knows what your vote is. The idea here is that you own your own farm. You are basically like a small business owner. You are not beholden to anybody, and you have your independence. So now the reality again is that Jefferson is also an advocate for manufacturing and for commerce. He's not a big fan of banks in the finance industry, like many people, even down to the day, they don't trust that particular endeavor. But it can be an exaggeration. But he did view that the agricultural base of the economy was key, and that we needed to spread everything out. What is interesting here is today, this is something we talk about now in a different context because we don't look at an agricultural based economy, but we still talk about the concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few people, which is essentially what he was advocating against. All right. Let's see. For that reason, we'll go to the second bullet point here. We don't have to talk about Thomas Malthus right now, but the occupation of the West was necessary for a number of reasons, but one that provided the land for a growing population, right, to move out there and have that land available so that they could keep those people acquiring land and becoming farmers with ownership. All right. All right. Now, probably the biggest success of his administration was going to be the Louisiana Purchase. All right. We think of Louisiana today, we're going to think of the state. Louisiana at this point is the territory, and that is much, much bigger. All right. Louisiana Territory is basically, yes, what encompasses what's now the state of Louisiana, but all the way up the Mississippi River to Canada, and all the way up the Missouri River to Montana and Idaho. Borders with Spanish territory at this time would be somewhat vague, but there'll be a map up here. You can see what it is on the next slide. Keep in mind, after the 7 Years' War, that had been ceded from France to Spain. With Napoleon taking over Spain, he put his brother on the throne of Spain. His brother then gave Louisiana back to France. All right. And if you remember, we had in 1802 a revolution down in Haiti. And a few things happened from that. Of course, we discussed how that was a slave revolt and how that was like maybe the one time that you saw, if not cooperation, at least they did not oppose each other. But you saw pretty much every European power trying to suppress the slave revolt to keep slaves within all the other colonies from getting the idea that they could successfully overthrow their plantation system in the other Caribbean colonies. But also that would spread a lot of people to what's now the United States and inspire some slave revolts over here. The Gabriel's conspiracy, well, no, Gabriel's a little earlier, but Denmark Vesey, I think, would be one that could trace some, even though it's a little later, like 1822, has some origins in the Haitian Revolution. What you have also, though, is Toussaint Louverture was able to hold off not just the French, but he held off Napoleon's troops as well as the British troops that were sent over there to put down that revolt. All right. And what you see is Napoleon looking this as a strategic matter. Number one, he's fighting everybody in Europe. So if you have a revolt in territory in the New World, he's got to take troops away from France and send them to the New World to defend territory over here. And he doesn't want to do that because that hurts his chances of winning in Europe. Second, if that is French territory, even if there's not a revolt, let's say Britain comes over and takes it away, then you have all these French resources from a place like Louisiana. Now they are in the hands of the British, and they're being used against the French, right? And again, he may have to send French resources to try to keep that out of the hands of the British. And that may not even be something that happens because it may not be possible. It may be a worthless endeavor. Either way, the colonies are something he has to defend, and strategically, tactically, they hurt his efforts back over in Europe. So keep that in mind because that's something that the Haitian Revolution has kind of demonstrated to him that it's going to cost him more and weaken his ability to defend himself in France to either suppress revolt like in Haiti or to defend that territory from his enemies if they decide to and whether it's a revolt or the say British take those territories, either way that could be a revolt and then they sign up and support the British. Either way, the resources go to the enemy. Right? All right. The thing is that it actually is going to be a solution to the problem. How do you keep from having to send troops over to Louisiana to stop a revolt? How do you make sure the British don't take over this territory and use everything from Louisiana against France? Well, you give it to the Americans. And then the British aren't going to start a war with us, all right, to get that. And if there is a revolt, it's going to be against us. And we have to solve the problem, not the French. So keep that in mind. This is a big part of why he sells it to us. Now, it's also going to be sold to us, so he needs money to fight in Europe, so that's going to be a boon to him to a certain extent. All right. Now, the Spanish commander doesn't even go ahead and turn the keys to the city essentially back over to the French yet in 1802. All right, Jefferson sends Robert Livingston over, all right, to talk about just getting a little piece of land. Like, yeah, give us a square mile so we can like send some boats down to Mississippi and just load them onto big ships to send them across the sea. That's all Jefferson wants, right? And they come back with, well, let's talk about buying the whole thing. And so that expands the whole discussion. And then James Monroe is sent over there to help with those negotiations. He's the one that really pushes it through. All right. And what we end up with is a sweetheart deal, $15 million in exchange for, again, this is 830,000 acres. It's really not known at the time because the border is not fully defined between the Louisiana territory and what's going to be left with Spanish territory. All right, or for that matter, the Oregon territory. All right. Now, as we said, the Federalists are concerned that all this is going to be states that support Jefferson once they become states. But that would have been way in the future anyway. All right. 1810, you got some Americans who are moving down into Florida, West Florida specifically, and they just moved down there, declare an independent republic. We take over that territory 2 years later. Now, don't confuse West Florida with where we're living. All right. West Florida is the panhandle, but not even the panhandle that is now part of the state of Florida. At this point in time, Florida and the Spanish claims extended all the way to the Mississippi. So when we talk West Florida, we're looking really at territory that's now in the state of Mississippi and Louisiana. All right, not territory that's in the state of Florida in its modern borders. All right. All right, the Adams-Onis Treaty is not going to come out to 1819, but that's when we're going to get Spanish Florida added on here. As you can look at the map, you can see Spanish Florida, and you can see how that extends all the way over at that time to New Orleans, all the way to the river New Orleans, and you can see the tan color. New Orleans is actually in the tan color, but it's right on the border with what was then Spanish Florida. All right. Now, Mobile actually is going to stay in Spanish territory, so it's really over. If you go down from west of Mobile, that's what we're talking about breaking off in 1810. All this tan territory is the Louisiana territory that we are picking up. And those borders are actually in dispute at this time because there's still debate, and it won't be solved until James Monroe's presidency about where the borders between Louisiana and those Spanish possessions actually are. And then the other things that you see there are the explorations that are going to take place once we buy it. Everybody's heard of the Lewis and Clark expedition. You can see that that goes from St. Louis all the way up and crosses into the Oregon Territory, all the way to the Pacific coast and back. Pike's expedition, famous for finding Pike's Peak, right? Then less known, the Freeman expedition going up the Red River, and Pike, of course, took a second expedition up the Mississippi towards the headwaters, and be a bunch of others that don't get on the map here over the course of time. But essentially, we're going to do this anyway. The Lewis and Clark expedition was already being planned, and we would have done that one. We'd asked permission from Spain to do it, but we would have done that whether we got it or not, apparently. Right. This was a very famous expedition. It was very, very well organized. Lewis and Clark were military officers, and most of the crew were also military. The exception was they had a guide that they picked up along the way named Sacagawea. All right, she was Shoshone, and she assisted them. All right, she was actually living with a group of people we refer to as the Blackfeet. Picked up, went to basically the West Coast and back, returned to St. Louis. As you can see, it took 3 years, but cataloged the what would essentially become the trade route overland, and also, for the most part, the route that would be used later for both the California and Oregon trails, with the California trail breaking off from it. Right. Right. Eventually, that would also be a lot of military posts set up there. All right. All right. Jefferson's principles, foreign policy. This gets us into a second term, and this is where we are going to see a big turn. His first term was pretty successful. He is a hard one to evaluate. A lot of historians put him very high. I tend not to. I think he's actually pretty bad as president. His first term is pretty successful. He doesn't have anything really bad happen. He does make the Louisiana Purchase, which is huge. It does have some bad things in it. I mean, the fact that the impeachment trials went on, and those were basically politically motivated and were allowed to happen until that precedent was set with Samuel Chase's. That was definitely a negative, not really a good thing from our modern standpoint. To be honest, if you evaluate the Louisiana Purchase, it was obviously important. It was well negotiated, and the fact that he sent Monroe over there, Monroe handled it very well and pulled that out very well. He had a huge constitutional debate when he came back, and Jefferson had to reconcile his principle of strict interpretation of the Constitution with basically what any idiot would just pick up this and say, there's no way we can turn this down. The Constitution does not make any provision for the president signing off on the acquisition of land like this. And in his strict constructionism, he would say that basically it should be unconstitutional because that is not a power given to the president, all right, or to Congress, all right. But he did it anyway because, again, any fool would there's no way you could turn that sweetheart deal down. He kind of, but at the same time, this is a deal that probably, if Adams was in office, probably would have fallen into Adams' lap too. So it's hard to really say this was something that was like due to his greatness as president. When we break into the second term, what we see here is there's a whole lot of stuff here that is very bad. He's basically going to devastate the economy, divide the country more than it's ever been. And even though the War of 1812 breaks out under his successor, really it's a lot of his policies that drive us towards that direction. And really, we're going to get to the point where we're actually seeing New England being the first states to talk about seceding during Madison's administration, and a lot of that is driven by the policies Jefferson is implementing here at the start. All right, I'll go through. He does have one major success. I'll go through that and then stop here and then pick up and finish up his less successful stuff in the next lecture, and I'll post that one separately. All right, basically, we've looked at the first term. He gets reelected. He does start to rebuild a navy. All right. Between 1801 1805, he starts sending out Navy ships, and the purpose here, the reason he's rebuilding this navy, is to defend U.S. commerce against the Barbary states. These are states in North Africa, roughly aligned with modern day Tunisia, maybe into part of Libya. Tripoli is really the city where we're centered at, which is in Libya in modern days. But we talk about these people as being pirates. Essentially, they are. They dominate the trade routes there, and what you see is shipping from all countries in Europe that passes into the Mediterranean Sea has to basically go pretty close to them. What they do is essentially charge people to pass through, and if you don't pay them, they seize your ship. So basically, they either engage in piracy and take your shipping and sell your crew into slavery, take your ship's goods and sell it, or they'll let you basically buy them off. You can basically bribe them, or whatever term you want to use. We had been doing that ever since Washington was in president. We had paid them off so that they would leave our shipping alone. That's what a lot of countries did. France, Great Britain, most of the countries of Europe paid them. And what happened was, not that we just got tired of it, but that they went up in the price. And when they just demanded more money, that was when we essentially decided that we would employ a navy to force their hand. All right. By the way, the chart that you see up here actually is going to be relative later, but you can see how this is our overseas trade fluctuating. Come back to this later when we get to Jefferson's policies, really. I'll probably reposition that within the slideshow. All right. European war is going to start again in 1803. Britain and France are starting to resume seizing American shipping. Despite that, with all the ships that they do seize, and Britain also impressing American sailors, we are still making huge profits despite all of the shipping that they do just seize, and we lose that part of the investment. American shippers are still making incredible profits off of what does get through. All right. So we'll basically pick up there. All right. And post that separately. This gives us quite a bit. What you're going to see is, by the way, if we look at this, 1803, you'll see right about here, the war is carrying up from 1790. That's when the French Revolution is basically starting. basically you see everybody declaring war, and you see our um, imports and exports both really growing. When you have this relative peace, you see everything declining, but then you see war breaking out again. So this is with all that seizure of our goods. You see that our exports are still going, we're still selling more than we ever have before, even with whatever they're taking. So you see, this is why I say we're willing to still send stuff over there. That's, if they were just taking stuff and we were going broke, we would just stop. Nobody would send another ship over there if we were just losing money. The reason we're still sending ships over there, despite the fact that they're taking some of the ships, is that we are making insane amounts of money off of it, despite that. All right. All right. Now, these valleys that you see here, and when we get down to the War of 1812, obviously we're at war, but when you see these down here that are almost as bad, this is what I mean when I say that Jefferson is going to tank the economy with his policies. All right. He really devastates the New England economy. It's very rare that a president can, if we're in a depression, presidential policies really take sometimes years to have a noticeable effect. All right. In having some movement to pull us out of a depression. And usually, like, the presidents go in and Congress passes laws, and they might have some small impact on the government. But you really have to do something major to have a huge negative impact like that. It's hard for the government to do policies that really boost the economy quickly like that. But you can really screw it up with some bad policies. It's easier to screw it up quickly than it is to fix it quickly. It almost never happens that way. All right, and you can see that they did that. So, all right, that's it for now. Pick this up later, and hopefully have that posted before Thursday so y'all can watch that before the class session. All right, thank you, and see y'all when y'all get back.